I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is, this House do now adjourn. Dr. Phillip Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The title of this evening's debate, I never thought I'd see the day when I could write Mobile Army Surgical Hospital as my debate, as someone who grew up watching that television series, and indeed it partly inspired me to become a doctor. But there's a serious point to be made today about what I'm going to suggest as a proposal for a capability for this country to be able to deploy abroad. I started thinking about it following the Syria vote in August. I voted against the motion, indeed both motions before the House that day. And following that, I thought, well, I need to come forward with a constructive suggestion for our engagement with the crisis in Syria. And this is my suggestion. I will present some sort of history of field hospitals in general, just a brief one, don't worry, and then discuss the humanitarian response capability that I think we need, and maybe then mention the challenges of bringing it about, and perhaps more importantly, the details of the facility. As I just said, I became a doctor for a number of reasons, but a couple of things spring to mind. One was a book written by a commander in the Royal Navy, a chap called Rick Jolly, who wrote a book called The Red and Green Life Machine, which was the field hospital in the Falklands War. It was set up in a disused abattoir in San Carlos Bay. I read this book when I was about 13. I also watched every single episode of the MASH television series, indeed every single one, and from that I sort of developed the desire, the ambition to initially to become a trauma orthopaedic surgeon. I then subsequently went to medical school and decided that I was going to be a GP. But what I suppose inspired me was the desire to actually do something to help people in distress, and that it should be a constructive action, not a destructive one. I must stress, though, that I'm no pacifist, and that I didn't vote against the intervention in August lightly. In fact, I'm in favour of quite significant intervention if it is well thought through and coherent and is backed up by a strategy for the region. But I am against sort of the willful, somewhat reckless destruction of assets in a sort of small way, because I think it can actually breed more problems going forward. Specifically to do with Syria, which is the ongoing crisis that we're having to experience via our TV screens. I first visited this country in 1998, and I then went back as Vice Chairman of the Conservative Middle East Council in February 2011, about 3 weeks before the civil war started. I have a sort of a sense of association with this country. I enjoyed both of my visits, particularly the first one when I was backpacking around as a medical student. And so I've visited Homs, I visited Hama, I visited the beautiful parts of Aleppo that I fear are no longer intact. And so when I came back, I was gripped with a sense of foreboding, for sure, that I thought that trouble was about to start. I didn't think so quickly, but unfortunately it did. But I also felt a sense of wanting Britain's engagement with this country through its crisis to be constructive, to try desperately to bring about a peaceful end to the war. The problem is, though, is that since then we've had over 100,000 deaths. We've had over 2 million people migrating away from the chaos. We've had one public chemical weapons use. There have been others suggested. And we've all had to endure some pretty appalling footage of death and destruction of primarily innocent civilians, of women, of children. And it's pretty shocking to have to endure it. And I think that our response to it should be multi-pronged. I think we could foresee a situation when hard power is wielded, but I think also soft power should also be considered. And this is where I come to the sort of the MASH facility, the Mobile Army Surgical hospital facility that I envisage, that I think Britain should have. Now, the history of field hospitals goes back actually to Napoleonic wars, to the gentleman who's called the father of combat medicine, Baron Dominique Jean Larrey. And from that concept of forward surgical hospitals bringing medical support to combatants at the front line. From that point onwards, there were slow developments, but I guess the fastest development that took place was during the Korean War in the early 1950s, and it is that war that the television series is based upon, although it was always associated with the Vietnam War because of when the programme was made. And during the Korean War, the major developments were made of pushing field hospitals closer to the front line, and that famous image of a helicopter, a Bell helicopter with two casualties strapped in stretchers on either side of the helicopter, that purpose of sort of bringing people back and being treated very quickly. And they had this dictum that life takes precedence over limb and function over anatomical defects. Well, since then, there have been massive advances. I mean, we've moved now to a situation, I've not yet visited this hospital in Camp Bastion in Afghanistan, but I'm told it is a remarkable facility delivering the very best trauma care. But I think of particular note to Britain is our experience in Kosovo in 1999, where the British Army managed to create essentially a tented village for a load of refugees, as well as medical facilities. And it was a fantastic success. And it was just proof of what we are capable of, particularly what our military is capable of. And I think this is where the sort of thoughts, of course I will give way.
First of all, can I congratulate the honourable member in bringing this matter, this innovative idea to the House for consideration. I have a TA ambulance unit in my constituency who are renowned for the good work that they've done and the good work that they can do. Does the honourable gentleman see this MASH unit, the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital unit, does he see that as been staffed by regular soldiers or by TA soldiers? Because I believe both can do the job equally.
Well, I thank the honourable member for the intervention. I was going to come to this, but I do see it as a reserve force, not as part of the regular army, though I suspect there will be some logistics staff maintaining the kit, the facility.
But the honourable gentleman give way
of
on
course.
That point. On that point, thank you, Deputy Speaker, and thank you for your honourable gentleman for giving way. I had a field surgical team under my command in Bosnia in 92-93, absolutely vital. A mixture of regulars and territorials were operating it. One point I would make, though, do not think this is necessarily soft power, because it needs security and it needs to be guarded.
And I thank the honourable gentleman for the intervention, and of course he has a wealth of experience in the field in this matter. I was also going to come to the need for security, because it's been quite interesting, the discussions I've had since I first mentioned this at Defence Questions, the discussions I've had, there's been some disagreement about the level of security required, actually, so I will come to that. But I think the broader point is that this is about the retasking of our armed forces. I mean, clearly there's a lot of change going on at the MOD, and there are some cuts to regiments and to forces, but there's also a need to reconfigure forces so that they're not just interested in delivering hard power, but also more softer power. And because ultimately I think that any response to a crisis, and this could also be a natural crisis, a natural catastrophe like an earthquake, or indeed the civil war in Syria, I think there needs to be some joined up thinking across all of the parts of government that would be involved. But of course I'll give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I congratulate him on securing this debate and on the excellent idea that he's putting forward. It has my full support. In terms of the working between Defence and DFID, obviously there's been big increases in the budget for our international development funds, but really quite severe decreases in Defence. Perhaps this is one for the Minister rather than my honourable friend, but is there not a strong argument that when the army is deployed on humanitarian grounds, that money should actually come out of the defence the DFID budget rather than the defence budget?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. Yes, and I was going to come to that. I think this should be a DFID-funded capability. But this capability, it needs to be constructive. A friend of mine talked about blue overalls, not blue helmets, i.e. that we have a UN force with blue helmets. Why not we have a force of people in blue overalls, i.e. that our intervention shouldn't be necessarily military in its appearance. We can also intervene in other ways. It should also be resourceful, because we're good at this stuff. We can draw upon our experiences in the Balkans, our experiences prior to that in the Falklands. I've already mentioned Rick Jolly's field hospital. And before that, we're very good at this. We have the expertise, we have the clinical expertise in particular. But it also should be a capability that could be expeditionary, i.e. go abroad. And I foresee a sort of situation with Syria that it could be located in a friendly country like Jordan. But it also has a domestic application. I mean, God forbid that there was ever a chemical attack in this country. You know, you could deploy this facility to be used in this country. But the core goal of all of this should be that we should be trying to develop a stable world for which all of us would appreciate. And that can be brought about by making friends and influencing people. The Arab street is not necessarily with the British. It's not necessarily with the Americans. We need to persuade people on the ground, the civilians, that we do not have always a malign, a vested interest, a sense that we're just doing it for ourselves attitude and approach towards the Middle East, that we're actually there to do constructive things, to do good things, to help people in a genuine way. Now, the details of this capability, this capacity, well, the discussions I've had, at least a 50-bed facility is I would envisage, maybe larger. I suspect, actually, that if it's as successful as I think it will be, I think we might be extending this, and I think it will be more than that, but I think 50 beds would be a good starting point. I think it should include a CT scanner. This is often something not available in the more sort of rural areas, the more far-flung destinations, and you can put CT scanners into containers. And there are companies, Marshalls up at Cambridge, that make container hospitals. There's no reason why we can't do this. We need to consider whether it should also have paediatric and obstetric services, because clearly it's not just the soldiers that you saw in the MASH TV series that are coming in. You're going to be seeing the children that were affected by that neurological agent in that dreadful footage, but you're also going to have women coming who happen to be pregnant at the same time as having sustained an injury. So we need to be thinking about that. Now, I guess the cost is always relevant when it comes to government. There are some figures. The Finns apparently purchased a sort of hospital for deployment for about £5 million. I envisage this probably between £5 and £10 million. And I think it should be a military asset. I think it should be something that is actually sort of run by the military, because I think they're the best to do it, but it should be reserve, not regular, primarily reserve, staffed with reservists. Because the military logistics are important here. Trying to get a facility like this fast into the field, really, to be honest with you, the best people for this are the army, and I think Kosovo is an example of that. And their command and control systems, all those sort of things are all relevant. But as you rightly say, as my honourable friend rightly said about the security, I think the security of this facility is of paramount importance. I think this would be a target, personally. I think if you saw a facility that was clearly hearts and minds, that was delivering care on the ground, if I was an Islamist, if I was a jihadist, I'd be thinking, well, we need to knock that out, because that's actually going to start changing minds and changing attitudes. So I think the security of this facility would need some thought, and I think in the example of Syria, RAF Akrotiri being close by, the deployment of troops in exceptional circumstances, that sort of thing, maybe needs to be considered. But the clarity of funding above all, coming to what my honourable gentleman said, the clarity of funding is clearly important. The politics of international aid on the doorsteps of Bracknell are tough. Trust me, I get it quite often. And I think that this is one way of using DFID funds for something that is demonstrably humanitarian, but it is a way of leveraging in some funds to a defence asset that would be primarily used for humanitarian purposes, but always with the back of my mind that it could also be deployed if we ever went to war. Of course I give way.
Gentlemen, for giving way, most gracious. Just to say one thing, we're obviously looking at examples like Syria, Kosovo and elsewhere, where as a result of armed conflict. But there'll also be humanitarian examples where there's been a crisis, where there's been a disaster, where we can respond to as well. Does the honourable gentleman see that being a role for this mission as well?
honourable gentleman for his intervention. Yes, I do. In fact, the last MASH unit for the Americans was deployed for the earthquake in Pakistan in 2006, and it was given to the Pakistanis after that. So yes, I do, and I think there are, or the likelihood is, and I would hope actually that it would be less military, but actually that there are going to be these crises in the future, and yes, I think it should be used.
Would the honourable gentleman give way?
Of course.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Sorry to intervene a second time, but it strikes me as if this is going to work, the way to unmilitarise it is for it to be connected to the British Red Cross or the International Committee of the Red Cross. In that way, it certainly gets some kind of international protection in security terms.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention. There are some difficulties with non-governmental organisations being associated with military assets. And there are, and I've detected this in conversation, so I think that needs some thought.
We did it, though.
Of course, and I'm personally not against it, but I gather that there are some difficulties. So why haven't we done this? I mean, why do we not have this facility to go with? Well, I do wonder about this. I mean, DFID has global respect. I mean, it does good work. There are some issues, though, around DFID funding in terms of audit trails in sub-Saharan Africa and the like, and I think there is some some concerns expressed about where the money eventually ends up. And I think in a situation like this, where we can spend the money here at home for humanitarian aid, and as I understand the definition of international development funding, that is acceptable. Indeed, we could use marshals in Cambridge. I see my honourable friend from North East Cambridgeshire has joined us. I mean, we could actually, if we were to buy this facility new, we could purchase it at home, and it could be, DFID money could be used for a humanitarian purpose, as I understand it. And so what I don't understand is why isn't it happening? Is this silo thinking? Is this to do with DFID not talking to the Defence Department, not talking to the Foreign Office? If there is, I think we really have a responsibility to try and overcome those bureaucratic hurdles. I recognise that the MOD have some concerns about long-term liability of cost, long-term with regards to staffing. I'm sure the National Health Service will want to know, well, you're taking away my orthopaedic consultant, who's going to be doing his list? There are some issues around this, of course, and I'm not coming here with a perfect project all outlined and ready to go. But I see no reason whatsoever why this can't be brought about. Because I think if we could bring about such a British MASH unit, a mobile army surgical hospital, yes, with a Union Jack on the side, I think it would be fantastic for this country. I really do. I think our reputation would be enhanced. It is clearly desperately needed in Syria and the surrounding countries at the moment. We're dealing with a significant humanitarian crisis, which I know the Minister and his department are responding to in a very good way. But I think this added capability would be much valued. We can do it, and we can do it well. I'd like to end finally on a quote. And of course it had to be from MASH, because it would. I was expecting actually to turn up and hear people humming the tune from the television series in my behind me. The quote is from Hawkeye Pierce, who is the primary character in the series. He says, "I'm very impressed now with the terrible fragility of the human body and the unbelievable resilience of the human spirit." I think by creating this capability, I think we would be displaying the best facets of that human spirit, that we are all human beings. The quote comes from an episode titled Our Finest Hour. I think this actually, if we were to bring this about, it would play a part in creating a further finest hour in the history of this country.
Well done.
Alan Duncan.
Mr. Speaker, may I thank my honourable friend, the member for Bracknell, for calling for this debate on such an interesting topic. Put simply, I entirely agree that military field hospitals could play a vital role in any international humanitarian response. Indeed, the Department for International Development has collaborated with UK forces in humanitarian responses over many years. In Bosnia, for instance, well known to my honourable friend, the member for Beckenham, in East Timor, Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan and Haiti, to name just some of the more notable examples. DFID, the MOD and the armed forces continue to cooperate closely. Since 2007, this cooperation has been codified in a Memorandum of Understanding which sets out how DFID and UK forces will work together. Its main principles are that DFID will lead the UK's response to overseas disasters, that it can ask the MOD for military support if necessary, and that the MOD will charge DFID only the additional operating costs for example, ships or aeroplanes, and not the full capital costs. In requesting military support for overseas disasters, it is also clearly understood that UK defence requirements will always take precedence. Alongside this established framework of cooperation, the two departments have also made explicit provision to use military field hospitals if required. DFID has agreed with senior military medical colleagues that, subject to defence priorities, military field hospitals could be deployed as part of a DFID humanitarian response. To that end, DFID has visited the Army's 34 Field Hospital at Catterick Garrison, who are the MOD's designated Rapid Response Field Hospital. DFID has held detailed practical discussions with them and has contributed to their humanitarian training and preparedness. Importantly, it should be understood that the deployment of a military field hospital would require substantial logistical support. It could also require a considerable force protection package, which would have a bearing on the location and appropriateness of the facility. Our experience so far is that the use of any military assets is very expensive. Issues around permission to operate and the command and control of such a facility would also need to be agreed with the receiving nation, which for a military facility will inevitably prove a bit more complicated than for a civilian one. Yes, but we need to bear in mind the time.
I thank my right-honourable friend for giving way. Is another key point, if one takes a facility like Marshall's in Cambridge, which are specialists in building modular medical equipment of this sort, that the funding of that, the initial funding of that could come from DFID's budget under existing definitions, and that therefore will ease any discussions with those countries if they're concerned about the military aspect of the facility?
Well, spending on humanitarian issues is, of course, official development assistance, so in that respect, my honourable friend is right. But it also has to show value for money, and we need to know that the assets can be appropriately deployed, which is what I would like to come to further. So far, DFID has worked on the ground alongside UK forces in Bosnia, Kosovo, Sierra Leone, Iraq, and Afghanistan. DFID has also been able to use Royal Air Force aircraft and helicopters in earthquake and flood relief in Pakistan and in sending search and rescue teams to Indonesia. And the Royal Navy was able to make its Fleet Auxiliary Largs Bay ships available to help with relief after the Haiti earthquake. So far, UK military field hospitals have not been deployed under DFID auspices. However, the way it would work is that DFID would request the support of the MOD in response to a natural disaster in accordance with United Nations guidelines known as the Oslo Guidelines. Those guidelines stipulate that support should be provided in line with the humanitarian principles of impartiality, neutrality, humanity, and independence. They also state that military assets should not be requested, or should be requested, only where there is no comparable civilian alternative. This implies that the military asset must be the only way of meeting the particular need, and its use should be a last resort. Now, DFID has to design its humanitarian responses carefully, according to the specific humanitarian needs they face, and based on what responses are best provided by the UK and also by other donors. And very often, what works best is help to restore and rebuild an afflicted country's own health system. If a field hospital were needed, there are already well-established civilian organisations well used to providing them in humanitarian crises, notably, as has been mentioned, the International Red Cross. A civilian response will usually be what is needed in a delicate and complex situation, rather than a foreign military presence which, however well-intentioned, is still military and may not be welcomed. In Pakistan, for example, which again has been mentioned this evening, it was a difficult, finely balanced decision to include RAF aircraft in the NATO relief airlift, when extremists there had explicitly threatened the foreign relief effort and relief workers if NATO were to operate in Pakistan. Like other international donors, therefore, while we are glad to have military field hospitals available, we will use them as a last resort when it's too difficult or dangerous to use civilian measures, and if those circumstances permit a military medical unit to be deployed. DFID has also been building a UK civilian medical response capability. UK surgeons and other medical staff performed heroically in Haiti after the earthquake there in 2010, saving lives and limbs which could otherwise have been lost. And building on this experience, DFID is supporting a programme of training and regional workshops for NHS doctors and other medical staff to equip them to deal with the additional challenges of surgery in a conflict zone. This is underpinned by an arrangement with the Department of Health and the National Health Service to deploy surgical trauma teams drawn from the British Health Service. Many of these personnel will also be military reservists, thus further exemplifying the very good civilian-military cooperation across government. Now, my honourable friend has specifically mentioned the Syria crisis. As the House is aware, the UK government's relief response is considerable. The UK has so far pledged £500 million, making us the second largest donor. Much of this relief is to provide health and medical care. Through our funding, we are helping support vital medical help on civilian channels with civilian medical personnel, not all of the details of which can be openly revealed. But I can say that the range of services provided by DFID is very wide and very big. It includes ensuring the running, supply, and necessary specialist training for a large number of emergency surgical facilities, including in remote areas. For example, we are supporting primary health care centres to help look after vulnerable groups such as women and children, as well as the elderly, who often have chronic unmet health needs. In Syria's neighbouring countries, now hosting more than 2 million refugees between them, DFID-supported health programmes provide medical evacuations and ambulance services, widespread primary health care facilities, mental health and psychosocial services, and highly specialised facilities for victims of sexual and gender-based violence. We provide specialist training courses for health professionals, many of whom are specialist staff seconded into emergency departments to reinforce their capacity and specialist care. We provide health services for refugees as well as vulnerable resident populations which are hosting huge numbers of refugees in their communities. And DFID and MOD officials are in frequent touch in London and in the region. The need for and suitability of mobile field hospitals is often discussed. And while options certainly remain open, it's agreed that deploying a mobile field hospital at the moment would not be the most effective way to reach the diverse needs faced by so many people in so many different locations. DFID's new civilian surgical trauma facility also remains an option, but it has not been necessary so far to deploy a surgical team in any of the refugee hosting countries. Inside Syria itself, the level of conflict makes access to healthcare very difficult indeed in many areas, and unfortunately the security challenges also prevent the deployment of either a field hospital or a civilian UK surgical team. And DFID will therefore continue to support existing health facilities on the ground and will constantly review the situation. And so, yes, of course.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Could I ask my right honourable friend whether DFID has the capacity to deploy not just a surgical team, but the equipment and some, perhaps, primary buildings in support of that team? Is that what you are referring to in your speech?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, that DFID is well prepared always, as it were, to procure and lay its hands on any such equipment, to which end we have many framework contracts which permit us to draw at very short notice on many companies' equipment in order to do whatever is appropriate to whatever humanitarian situation we face, be it an earthquake, a tsunami, or a conflict. So in conclusion, Mr. Deputy Speaker, may I repeat that the government values its ability to deploy military surgical teams as an important option additional to other means of response. DFID's response is based on the needs on the affected population, and so far the need for a UK military field hospital has not arisen, but if it does, we remain ready to respond as required in the best and most appropriate way.